Greetings ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's Reddit series video from the subreddit HFY called Clint Stone Chapter 1 Freedom, written by some guy named Ted. The link to the original will be down below. And as always, I hope that you enjoy, and if you do, please consider subscribing. Translator note: all units have been converted to Sol Basic and all major changes to translation have been noted in text. I remember when I first met the human called Clint Stone. I was at Noir slave markets, paraded by my captors, who were trying to sell me for 745 marks. An insultingly low amount. I was worth at least 1,000. Anyway, I was lined up on one of the auction blocks for sale when I saw him, the man who would change my life. "Step forward," the auctioneer, with a deep voice and red-scaled skin, commanded. 20 slaves stood in a line facing the large crowd. No 3 slaves were alike. There was a tall, thin Guan who looked like he could use a few meals. At the end there were 2 Scythians standing slouched with the tentacles switching in anxiety or irritation. I was never good at reading squid faces. Scattered throughout were a variety of herd races. You know the type. Dumb, vacant faces can work for hours without a break. Favored labor for the fields. And there was me, of course. The handsomest, strongest, and smartest Johan that you will ever meet. My fur was straight and my face was clean. My claws were nice and shiny and my teeth were sharp. Yes, my right leg was crooked, but that was only because I had broken it jumping off the roof, running from the watchman after stealing a priceless jewel. That's kind of how I got put up into the slave market. But enough about me. You came here to hear about Clint. There was only one alien whom I did not recognize his species. He was a bipedal, like most. 2 arms, 2 legs, 1 head. Pretty standard fare for sentience of the galaxy. Apparently, that design is the best biologically. Don't ask me why. I don't know. He was shaped the same as the rest of us, but he was big. I'm talking enormous here. I'm tall for my species. Hell, for most species. At 4 feet and 9 inches from my toes to my nose. 5 feet from the top of my head to the ground. This guy was easily a foot taller than I was. I came up to his shoulder. It wasn't just his height either. He was extremely muscular. He was error. Idiom does not translate. Closer substitute, built like a tree. A very large tree. He looked like he could lift me, the guy next to me, and both our mothers in one hand. But he wasn't in chains like the rest of us. Instead, he had a little box attached to his neck. He was mostly hairless, which looked kind of odd to me, being covered entirely by fur. But I had been out in the galaxy long enough to know that the beings come in all kinds, some stranger than others. The top of his head was covered with a thick black hair that continued down the side of his head until it met his chin. There were patches of dark hair over his green eyes as well. Those green orbs, which I would come to know as piercing and intimidating, were fixed in some point in the space in front of him, staring vacantly. "Slave! Step forward," the auctioneer commanded. Looking at me, I did as he said, walking forward to stand in front of the platform. I stood and stared at the faces staring back at me. I vaguely heard the auctioneer describing me to the audience. My dashing good looks, my strength, my... Wait a minute. I am not an impudent little wretch. I turned my head to look at the auctioneer, but my neck chains were there to prevent that from happening. "Sold to the Mantus with the red suit for 575 marks, cried the auctioneer. "What? I've been sold for 575 marks? This was a disgrace. I should have been worth twice that." "Bring forward the human," the auctioneer boomed. 2 of his helpers pushed the strange aliens towards the front of the stage. "Folks, we have got a treat for you, one of the biggest, strongest alien races out there. The humans have yet to be added to the market, except for today. Taken fresh from his homeworld, this hulking specimen is the pinnacle of a labor force. During tests, he demonstrated strength levels over 9,000 Raccoon. He can labor for days without tiring. That's right, days! You don't want to miss this opportunity to get your very own human slave. Completely docile due to the neural implant. He will obey every order you give him. Do I hear 1,000 mocks? 1,100, 1,200. And on it went, until the numbers got so big as to be nearly unbelievable. The human eventually sold for 10,000 marks to the same mentis who had bought me. I was outraged. I was clearly worth more than a nobody from... Where was it again? Earth? That's right. It was at that point I decided I wanted to escape. Clearly this mentis did not view me as valuable, and so he wouldn't miss me. Thus, I really didn't like the idea of doing what people told me for the rest of my life. I'm kind of a lone wolf, if you can't tell. I also happen to be fairly adept at picking locks. Used to be a thief by trade. One time I had to pick through... Right. I'm not supposed to talk about that. Regardless, I'm good at picking locks is what I'm trying to get at. So later that night, when it was dark and out and the guards were asleep, I pulled out one of the nails in the floor and sprung myself from the iron chains. I snuck carefully past the rest of the slaves, making sure not to wake them. I didn't want to have to take care of anyone other than me. I almost made it to the door when I found a hand on my leg. I nearly shouted in surprise, but that would have alerted the guards. Instead, I settled for a good hiss. I looked down and I saw the human looking up at me with his dull eyes. "Help me," he said, each word sounding like I had to drag it out from the bottom of the ocean to say it. His eyes flashed, and for a moment I saw the man beneath the neural implant. That single flash was enough to convince me that this human would be very valuable to have by my side. I knelt beside the man and I grabbed the metal box on the back of his neck. "This is going to hurt," I warned him, and yanked. It came off with a little resistance. I was surprised. Whenever I had to pull one of those things off my friends, it took much more effort and a lot more blood. The human barely had a trickle. "Thank you," the human said. His voice was quite different from before. It was solid assured and sounded like honey pouring over rocks. My species puts lots of emphasis on the sound of someone's voice, and I knew from that single phrase that this one was to be respected and feared. Don't ask how I knew, just know that I did. He stood, rubbing his neck where the device had been. Standing this close to him made him seem even larger than he was. I had to crane my neck to see his face. It was like looking up at the treetops. He looked down at me and held my brown eyes as his bright green ones. No longer dull and vacant, they were full with life and intensity. They nearly shone in the darkness. He held out his hand to me. I took it in my paw and shook it. Well, more like placed my paw in his hand. It was so big it swallowed my paw. "My name is Clint Stone. I wish to thank you." Yeah. You can tell me your life story after we get away from the people who want to make us work to death, I interrupted him. "You're not going to fight them?" Clint asked in a puzzled voice. I looked at him in shock. "No, they have weapons. We don't. We have numbers and the element of surprise on our side, and you've never seen me fight," said the human in such a matter-of-fact voice that I almost thought he meant it. "Numbers? There are only 2 of us, and they have pulse rifles. Now stop talking and let's get out of here." Clint didn't say anything. He just walked over to the sleeping slave and grabbed its chains in his hand. He gave it a sharp tug, and it shattered between his hands. I stared. No wonder they had him hooked up to a neural implant. It was the only thing that could hold him. He walked from slave to slave, breaking the chains with one swift tug. I kept glancing nervously at the door, thinking that surely someone had heard that one. I shifted on my paws, but the human was done in no time. I turned to the door and started to work on the nail into the lock, wriggling it back and forth, trying to spring the lock. I gave it a sharp turn and the nail broke off in the lock. I sighed, knowing that that would mean that I would have to dig it out another nail and clear out the old one before I can try and pick the lock again. I felt the presence of the rest of the slaves, awoken by sounds of tearing metal. Clint took one look at the door and kicked it down. The door slammed into the wall opposite it with a loud crash. The guards had to have heard that one. They had. A pair of them ran down the hall towards the slave pens, rifles at the ready. They shouted at us to stop, but those who were thinking of freedom were not going to let anything as simple as a potentially fatal wound stop them. They freed slaves tried to escape down the hall, but the guard shut them down. In the leg, of course, no reason to kill property. The rest of the slaves scattered, frightened by the pulse fire and the blood. Not Clint. He walked down the hallway, marching towards the guard. I yelled at him to stop, but he was going to get himself killed. But he didn't. The guards were startled by the sight of the giant walking down the hallway towards them. Then they fired. Clint ducked under the pulse rifles and rolled towards the guards. He sprang back up to his feet and sprinted at the guards. They seemed to be so surprised that they didn't fire again until Clint was close enough to touch them, and by then it was too late. Clint grabbed a hold of each of their necks and smashed their heads together. I could hear the bones break from here. Clint motioned for me to follow him down the hallway, and I was too shocked by the ease at which Clint disposed of the two guards to follow. Perhaps he hadn't been exaggerating when he said he could take a whole garrison without a problem. A noise sounded behind me, and I hurried off to Clint. The hallway turned into a doorway, and that doorway led to a landing pad. On that landing pad was a ship of the Mantis design. I'm guessing it belonged to the same Mantis who brought me and Clint. I hesitated at the door, looking back. Clint continued on without me, walking towards the ship. "Coming, or what?" Clint asked. "Where are we going?" I responded. "I don't know," the human replied, "but we've got a whole galaxy to choose from." And from that day forward, Clint and I have traveled the stars, facing monsters that you cannot imagine, discovered lost civilizations, saving all manner of beings from the slave trade, getting into fights. Hell, we even got into a war once. But those are stories for another time. End of chapter. I hope that you enjoyed. If you'd like to support the channel or the author, all the stuff is down below. And as always, I hope that you guys have a good one, and I'll see you in the next story. Cheers.